Greetings, traveller. Here in the silence of this library, I uncover the most fascinating stories that have long been forgotten. Stay a while and listen, and I shall take you on a journey that has endured for centuries. Stories from Old World. Chapter 1. Camp of the Unwanted. Rain had a way of finding every seam in a man's courage along the Talabec. It came slantwise out of the pines, cold, persistent, tasting of iron, and soaked the Red Pike Company until even their oaths felt waterlogged. The palisade around Fort Rookstein's outworks sagged under the weight of it. Canvas snapped and slapped. Pitch smoke crawled along the mud like a wounded thing. They called him Tallow. He answered to it because it was easier than hearing his given name spat like a joke. Thin as a candle, pale as old fat, a wick of dark hair matted to a narrow brow. He looked every inch the nickname. The halberd on his shoulder dragged him to one side as he trudged the duckboards between tents, and the shield that had been issued to him for drills kept kissing the mud whenever he stopped to readjust the straps on his chafed forearm. "Eyes up, Tallow!" Sergeant Ketson barked from beneath the eave of a black sagging awning. "If the beast's in the trees, he won't be in your boots." "Yes, sir," Tallow said, voice small in the rain. Rodolph Ketson was all scars and bristles, with a voice like a grindstone and the particular patience of a man too stubborn to die. He flicked a look up and down Tallow's frame and grimaced. "Carrying that halberd, like you mean it would be a start?" "Yes, Sergeant." Across the trampled yard, a knot of veterans squatted around a brazier, steam rolling off their cloaks. One, Mathis, thick-necked and quick with a grin, caught sight of Tallow's struggle to plant the halberd butt without spearing a puddle. He smirked to the others. "Careful, lads. If the witch comes for us, Tallow will ward it off with a feather prayer." Laughter rose, rough and mean. Tallow's ears pricked hot and then cooled as the rain claimed the heat away. He breathed slow, a habit buried deep. A count of 7 in, 7 held, 7 out. It steadied his hands. It always had. Little tricks for little men. "Patrol's not going to walk itself," Ketson said. "Pikemen 3, crossbows 2, mouse." Tallow flinched. The sergeant's mouth tugged at one corner. "Tallow's with me on the flank, and if you drop that shield one more time, I'll nail it to your arm." They formed up at the gate, steam rising from damp wool. The world beyond the palisade was a wash of black trunks and fog, the Talabec's slow voice running somewhere to their right. A raven sat on a broken stake and watched them with oil-slick eyes. Priest Ulbrecht passed down the line with a charm of hammered brass, tapping each breastplate and muttering a litany of sturdy courage that smelled like wine and ink. He paused in front of Tallow, a heartbeat longer than the others, eyes kindly and pinched. "Remember the breath I showed you," he said softly, as if embarrassed he was saying it aloud. Tallow nodded. He had always liked Albrecht's voice, tired but sincere, not like the witch hunters. Marta Kappel stood near the gate, hat brim shedding rain, eyes like slate. She'd arrived 3 days ago, brisk as a winter knife, with a ledger of accusations, and a horse that didn't seem to fear the pines. She'd watched Tallow for exactly 12 heartbeats when she first saw him, and then looked away as if he were a ledger entry that did not balance, but could be ignored until later. "Keep your powder dry," she said now to no one in particular. "Keep your hands clean." Her gaze flicked past Tallow, then returned, curious as a cat at a shutter. "And keep your prayers small." The gate groaned. The Red Pike Company slid into the trees. The forest took them, the way a good card sharp takes a fool's coin, quietly, without fuss, leaving only an idea that perhaps nothing had happened at all. Rain pattered on needle and bark. Mud squelched. They moved in a ragged line along the old game path that skirted the river. Ears open for the goatskin drums the beastmen beat when they were too drunk on blood to stalk properly. Ketson raised a hand. They stilled. The path bent around a fallen oak and opened into a low hollow where water had gathered in a pool. Hoofprints, not horse, had scuffed the edge into a slurry. A crude sigil of horns, and a circle had been carved into the stump and smeared with something greasy. It smelled like tallow gone sour. Mathis spat. Ungors came through. Maybe a gore band. "We should burn it." "Later," Ketson murmured. "We're not equipped to light the forest today. Mark it." They pushed on. Tallow's breath misted the air in a thin ribbon. He kept the halberd canted, shield up. The weight of them made his shoulder throb, but the counting kept it in a pen. 7 in, 7 held, 7 out. When the path pitched up and then slanted down again, his boot skidded and the shield slipped. He caught it before it clanged, biting his tongue on a curse, and saw Mattis's grin over his shoulder. "Feather prayer," the grins said. He ought to have been used to it by now. He'd been a chandler's apprentice in Bogenhafen before the levy took him. Hands good for knots and heat and slow tasks, not for swinging steel. He had a gift, Albrecht said, but a small one. A knack for laying a calm hand on a man too filled with fear to see straight. A whisper to steady fingers. A prayer to clear the breath for a shot. Tiny benedictions that passed unnoticed if the work went well and were laughed at if it didn't. Respect was a coin someone else minted and rarely spent on men like him. They reached the old watch stump where the path forked, left to the ferry ruins, right along the ridge toward a line of tumbled menhirs that locals called the Giant's Teeth. Ketson raised a fist to halt, listening. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. The first horn came low and thin, like a man swallowing his own cry. The second was nearer, and there were voices, bleating, braying, snarls. "Cover!" Ketson snapped. They broke for the trunks, crossbows up, halberds braced. "They'll try to rush the pool behind us. We hold here." Tallow slid in behind a fir whose bark chewed splinters from his cloak. He could see them now, shapes between trunks, the flash of yellowed teeth, twisted horns slick with rain. Ungors, yes, and 2 gors looming over them with cleavers of rusted iron. They came in a ragged crescent, trying to wrap around the pool and roll the men into the mud. Mathis lifted his head and bellowed, "Come on then!" He grinned at Tallow, where they crouched 5 paces apart. "Say a real prayer for once, Tallow, or just think hard." Tallow swallowed. He did not look at Mattis again. He looked instead at the man nearest him, a boy named Otto, moustache trying and failing to be a man's, fingers trembling on the stock of his crossbow. "Otto," Tallow whispered. The boy flinched and almost misfired. "Breath, here." He set his shield down and put 2 fingers gently on Otto's wrist. "Hold, 7 out. I am with you. Your hands are your hands. They will do what they have always done." Otto blinked, mouth working. The tremor steadied. He nodded. Aye. The first Ungors broke cover, shrieking, hooves skidding. Crossbows thrummed. 2 went down, bristling with quarrels. Then the Gors lumbered forward, and the line shook. Up! Ketson roared. Pikes! Tallow slotted his halberd and rose. The first Gor slammed into the pike wall and got a blade between its ribs. It bleated and hacked, and men screamed. Tallow swung awkwardly, the halberd's head whipping his shoulder too wide. The buck caught in a root and nearly pitched him forward. Someone cursed behind him. He felt the line begin to tilt, the way a table does when an oaf leans too hard on one corner. Panic sniffed at him. He dropped the halberd, snatched up his shield, and stepped into the gap in the line. The Gor's cleaver came around in a chopping arc. He caught it on the rim, and the impact rattled his bones. The beastman's breath stank of wet hay and old blood. Tallow thrust with his short sword the way Ketson had shown him 100 times, and the blade bit into thick hide and slid, more like cutting rope than flesh. The Gor bellowed and shouldered him, and he stumbled, boots skidding, almost going to a knee in the mud. A hand like a vice clamped the back of his collar and yanked him straight. Ketson's voice was in his ear, raw and furious. Up, Tallow, up or we die. He found his feet. The second Gor went down under 3 pikeheads. Ungors squealed and fled. Crossbows took 2 more, and then it was only the hiss of rain and hard breathing and the smell of bile. Hold, Ketson said. The line shivered, then steadied. Mathis laughed first. By Ulric's cold, Tallow's shield actually stopped something. More laughter, because that was the currency here, and if you didn't spend it, someone took it from you. Tallow bent and picked up his halberd with hands that tried to shake and then remembered the breathing. 7 in, hold. They policed the bodies with a quickness learned by men who knew the woods did not like them. Otto grinned shyly at Tallow and said, "Thanks." It tasted like warm soup on a winter tongue. Tallow nodded and said nothing. Words would snuff it. Ketson took the tally and sent a runner back to the fort with the news and a bundle of crude charms cut from Ungor hides for burning. On the stump, someone had smeared over the horned circle with mud. Make a thing ugly, and then uglier still. And maybe it will leave you alone, Albrecht always said. They turned to go, and Tallow saw it at the base of the stump, where the greasy mark ran down into the mud like melted wax. A fragment of leather, scorched and stiff, with a sigil stamped into it. An 8-pointed flower that might have been a wheel or a star or a meat grinder, half burned but determined to exist. His fingers moved before the thought did. He slid the scrap into the rag-bound inside of his cloak, where he kept his little packet of herbs and Albrecht's worn litanies. He felt stupid and young and hungry, and he didn't know why. Rain marched them back to Raukstein. They banged mud from boots, stacked spears, and bowed before Albrecht, who smelled of rain-wet parchment and old figs. He spoke the names of the fallen, none today, and the names of those saved, some perhaps, and asked the god to keep a patient book. Marta Kappel watched the men with that quick bookkeeper's flick of attention that makes sums even when no one has asked for them. When her eyes came to Tallow, a raven croaked from the palisade, and she looked away. In the tent he shared with 7 others, Tallow peeled his soaked tunic from his skin and rubbed dry with a rag that had once been a shirt. His hands were raw at the knuckles where the shield's rim had bitten him. The skin was lined with grime and old wax from candles long made. He tugged his cord around his wrist straight. Plaited leather with narrow cuts notched in it from when Albrecht had taught him to count his prayers, to order his little gifts, a way to keep himself honest about how many times he asked and how many times he thanked. He found the scorched scrap and looked at it while the tent flapped and the men muttered and snored. He had seen marks like it in crudely inked warnings on wayside shrines. He had heard Albrecht name it in a voice you did not use for naming, chaos, and Ketson spit into the dirt when he heard the word, as if the spit could make a moat against it. He did not know why he had taken it. He did not know why he rolled it between thumb and forefinger until his skin felt a little warm. He looked up, and the tent was the tent, and men breathed, and outside, the pines confessed nothing to the wind. "Stop stroking your love letters," Mathis mumbled from his pallet. "Sleep, Tallow. Tomorrow we can pray your halberd learns its own way to a throat." There was nothing to say to that did not cost him something he couldn't spare. Tallow tucked the scrap into the fold with Albrecht's prayers. He lay back, listened to the rain, and tried to imagine his father's shop. The clink of copper moulds, the hiss of hot tallow poured, the soft cluck of cooling wicks. Respect came in those days as a nod from a man whose candles didn't gutter in a draft. The horn sounded in the third watch. Beastmen again, testing, prodding, never far. The Red Pike Company staggered up like a dog jerked awake to chase a rat and ran, panting and cursing, to their stations. Tallow's body moved before his mind, which is how fear is supposed to work if you want to live. They held the north ditch while Albrecht muttered, while Capel stalked the wall and pointed at places where men were too loud with their fear. A handful of Ungors skittered up and fell under quarrels and pikes. A larger shape lurched out of the trees and then thought better of it and stopped. In the lull, Tallow found himself near Otto again. The boy's hands shook even with the breath counts. Tallow put his fingers to his wrist again and felt the flutter there like a bird trapped in a jug. He breathed with him until the bird remembered the shape of the sky. "Better?" he asked. Otto swallowed. "Better?" Mattis saw what he saw and rolled his eyes. "Dolling out feather prayers again. You'll spoil us. We'll forget how to piss standing up." Ketson cuffed him without looking. "Hush and point your steel at the trees." They held. It wasn't a battle. It was the education a forest gives the men who insult it by existing. When it was over, the rain was less. Dawn was a smudge behind the clouds. Ketson walked the ditch and looked at his men like they were casks to be rolled. He stopped in front of Tallow. "You held. Better than yesterday. I thank you." "Don't thank me." He angled his head at the blind, wet pines. "Thank the ones who decided not to show, and learn to hold that polearm like a man who means it. You try to fight with your wrists, it'll take your hands, and then ask for your tongue." Tallow nodded, flushed stupidly with the praise that wasn't, and Ketson's mouth did that corner tug again, which might have been a smile if a man were feeling generous. After, Albrecht gave a brief blessing and then walked with Tallow to the cook fire, where porridge slumped in a dented pot like a sulking dog. He handed Tallow a steaming wooden bowl and said, "Walk." They went along the inside of the palisade, the rain washing their hair into shapes that made them look like men from a woodcut about poor choices. Albrecht did not speak until they had passed the gate where Capel leaned like a carved saint, listening to her own thoughts. "You are useful," Albrecht said simply. Tallow barked a laugh and then swallowed it, to hold places where others would stand better, to steady a boy who would have shot a friend by mistake, to mind your breathing and theirs. Albrecht's eyes were kind, even when his mouth wasn't. Not every gift is iron. Tallow felt the scorched scrap against his ribs, as if it were heating under Albrecht's gaze. He 3/7th'd his breath deliberately. "Mattis says I spoil them." "Mathis will be useful until the day his nose leads him into a stew pot," Albrecht said. And it should have been unkind, but came out as a blessing, because that's who Albrecht was. "We are not all axes." Tallow looked at his hands. They were not axes. They were the hands that could coax tallow to pour smooth and never bubble. Hands that could swell a wick without scorch. He curled them until his knuckles creaked, coy as a child pretending to be a monster. Albrecht saw the motion and then looked away, pretending he had not. "Tell me," he said, changing lanes so deftly it didn't feel like a change at all. "When you pray, what do you feel?" Tallow thought. "Quiet, mostly. Like I'm putting a bowl under a leak and it's catching a trickle. Sometimes, a warmth in my chest. Like bread." Albrecht nodded, pleased. "Bread is very fine. Keep to bread. Don't go chasing meat when you cannot chew it." Tallow tried to laugh and made a sound like a man stepping on a twig. They ate in companionable silence until the porridge was gone and the rain thinned to a drift of ghosts. Albrecht squeezed Tallow's shoulder once, and then drifted off to scold a crossbowman for using the blessed brass charm as a bottle opener. Tallow sat a while longer with the empty bowl between his palms, feeling his hands grow warm from the memory of heat. A raven gronked from the palisade. It shuffled its feet and watched him with one eye, then the other. It looked like it knew a story he wasn't going to like. He stood, loosed the strap on his shield, refastened it, adjusted the halberd, then did it again, because the same thing twice sometimes makes the world feel possible. He walked to the practice yard and set himself opposite a worn post where the men had blunted their steel into grooves over months. He took his stance the way Ketson had taught, left foot forward, shoulders square, wrists straight. He cut and parried and cut, and the post did not change, and he did, a little. Sweat ran down into his eyes and stung like praise. Mathis passed and said nothing, which might have been a gift. Tallow kept at it until his arms were jelly and his lungs burned, and the post had learned nothing. That evening, a runner came in with news of a raiding band bold enough to threaten a hamlet upriver that still dared to light hearths at night. The captain posted orders for dawn. "Red Pike marches," Ketson growled. "No stragglers. Pack as if you intend to come back but may not." The men laughed too loudly. They always did when a thing had too much truth inside it. Tallow lay in the tent, listening to the camp go to sleep in layers, the rattle and cuss and laugh, and the soft curses of men who dream their wives are real, and then the deep waves of night sounds when the woods decide you can stay for a while longer, but not forever. He reached into his cloak and took out Albrecht's litany and the scorched scrap. He traced the ragged, unreadable prayers on one with his fingertip, and then, without thinking, traced the half-crushed sigil on the other. For an instant, not even a heartbeat, less the ghost of a heartbeat, there was a sense under his skin, like the approach of a drum miles away. Not sound, the idea of sound. A cadence that wanted bones to be hollow, so it could fill them with a rhythm. It left him dizzy and a little ill. He almost threw the scrap away. Instead, he pressed it flat between the pages of Albrecht's prayer and told himself he would show the priest in the morning and ask for a burning. He slept and dreamed of candlelight on brass and a low beat like marching far downstream. Dawn came up startled and grey. The Red Pike Company took the road in twos, pikes glinting like a field of mean wheat. The hamlet upriver was only thatch and worry, and when they reached it, they found it already gone to ash. The bones of the houses were black cages, and the air stank of wet char and the iron tang of slaughter. The men went quiet because there was nothing clever to say. Quetzal's jaw worked. Track them. No torches. Crossbows ready. If we catch the tail of them, we cut it off. They followed the churned mud and the streaks dragged along it. The tracks were a day old, maybe less. Ungors. Gores. Something heavier, hoofed, but not. The woods gathered around them in a sulk, and even the rain was less like rain and more like wet hands on the back of a man's neck. They caught the tail of them near a shallow ravine where the beastman had paused to defile an old stone marker with daubs of filth. 8 ungors, 2 gores, and a shape hunched and broad with horns like hooked blades. It turned when the red pike crested the ravine lip, and its eyes were small and patient. Mathis hissed between his teeth. Bestigor. Loose! Quetzal snapped. Quarrels flashed and thudded. 2 ungors spun and dropped. One got up again with a quarrel like a sticking up finger between its ribs. The beastman turned and came with the speed of starvation. The Bestigor came last and fastest. Tallow did not think. He could not. He had too much in his hands, steel and leather, and the weight of being watched. But his hands remembered the breath. He put 2 fingers on the wrist of the man to his left. This time, not Otto, but a veteran with a scar that tugged his lip into a permanent leer. The man shook him off without looking, and then glanced back a second later, confused, because he had found himself breathing easier for no reason he could name. Tallow smiled without meaning to, and then there was no time for smiling. The first ungor hit the pike wall and split like a rotten log under a good axe. The second shoved past and got a knife up inside someone's mail. There was screaming and steam and the smell of guts. A gore with one eye and a ring through its nose caught Tallow's halberd on its cleaver and pressed, laughing. Tallow stepped, twisted, and slid the beak of his halberd around and under and into the gore's thigh. It howled and swung, and the blade took a notch out of Tallow's shield and shook his arm to the elbow. He did not drop it. Someone shouted his name, not Tallow, and he tore his eyes from the gore to see the Bestigor coming for the center of the line like a priest for an altar. It had a sword of scavenged steel too broad for a man, and it held it like a man nonetheless. It hit the wall, and the wall flexed. It hit again, and the wall groaned. Mathis laughed because there was nothing else to do and went forward. The bestigor took him from hip to shoulder as if cutting bread. The laugh turned into two sounds and then none. The line wavered. Tallow's breath count shattered. The world went narrow. He dropped his halberd and stepped into the hinge where the bestigor had made the wall bend. He planted his feet on habit. He lifted his shield on habit. He opened his mouth to pray because Albrecht had told him bread was fine. Nothing came out. He felt the scorched scrap like a live coal against his ribs. It would be so easy. A voice as quiet as the rain suggested. It would be a cup of something hot handed to a man whose hands had been cold since before he could remember warmth. You could make them stand. You could make them more than men. He shut his eyes. 7 inches. Hold. The bestigor's sword hit the shield and skidded. He pushed back. Somewhere to his right, Ketson bellowed. To his left, someone sobbed. A quarrel took the bestigor in the shoulder. It snarled and turned, and in the turn it was just a beast, and the wall surged and buried it in iron. It bucked and came up and then went down and then stayed. It was over in the way all such things are over. Suddenly, as if a thought had been interrupted and no one quite knew how to finish it now. There were bodies. There were men breathing too fast and too slow. There was the smell like pennies. There was Mattis in 2 pieces. No one laughed. Ketson's voice came like a hand on a door. Count. He walked the line. Alive. With me. He knelt by Mathis and made a noise Tallow had not heard men make who hadn't been children in decades. Albrecht. Priest Albrecht came, kneeling in the wet mud, fingers white on the hammer that wasn't made to break grief. He spoke the words. He closed eyes. He did the work that is never finished. Tallow stood very straight and did not let his shield fall. When he put his hands to the rim to adjust it, they did not shake. The breath came and went and did not catch. He was very calm. The calm was the kind that comes after something slips and hits water. A thud, and then a smoothness. He helped wrap Mathis in a cloak. He said Mathis's name when Albrecht asked them to. He did not look at the scorched scrap as he felt it against his skin, like a question that wanted to be a promise. They burned the ruin they had found and sent smoke into the trees as a way of saying a thing that could not be said with words you would let your children hear. They took up the marching tread and went back toward Raukstein. The rain went thin and then stopped and then started again, because that is what rain does when it knows you don't want it. At the palisade, the men filed in, a few less than had filed out. Ketson stood them at ease and dismissed them in handfuls to eat and close their eyes and pretend sleep would dream them clean. Tallow did not go to the cook fire. He walked the inside of the wall until he found the gate where the wood kept a stain from a long ago fire. He slipped out and down the ditch and into the trees where the damp smell was thicker and there were places to hide from honest eyes. He walked north along the palisade's shadow until the ditch shallowly bridged a stream, and beyond it, in a stand of pines not 30 paces from command, the land pried itself open into a shallow bowl. In the bowl, under a slick of needles, were stones set in a circle so old they had learned to pretend they were not stones. He had stumbled on it the first week at Raukstein, dragging a latrine trench with 6 other men and swearing he'd never smell meat and not think of rot again. He had come back when he could not sleep because sometimes he did not want Albrecht to see him working his breath like a poor man counting coppers. He had sat in the bowl and listened to the rain and the near drum of his heart. He stood at the edge and clutched the scorched scrap until his nail beds hurt. He looked at his hands. He looked at the trees. He looked at the bowl until his eyes tried to make it into something else. The voice from the afternoon drifted back. It would be so easy. Albrecht would have said bread. Marta would have said burn. Ketson would have said hold and hit and hold some more and never ask why. Tallow eased down into the bowl, knee in the mud, and touched the stone with his fingertips. It was cold. It was a good cold. It was a wake-up cold. He reached into his cloak and brought out Albrecht's litany. He laid it on the stone as if setting a bowl on a table. He set the scorched scrap atop it, like a man putting a chipped cup beside a clean one and telling himself he will use the good cup and will not touch the other, but wants it near to prove he can ignore it. He breathed. The drum at the edge of hearing answered the breath the way a man at the back of a bar answers the song he hears in a language he half remembers. He pulled his fingers back as if burned, and then laughed softly because it was only stone. The raven croaked. It hopped along the palisade and peered down at him, head cocked, as if checking a sum. He looked up at it, and for a breath they were two creatures in a rain that did not care about either of them. Tallow whispered, "I want to be enough." The bowl did not echo. The trees did not laugh. The stone did not answer. He put his hand flat over the scorched scrap and felt heat that was not heat, and a sound that was not sound, and a hunger that was not his, and also was. He pulled his hand away, and the feeling clung to his skin as if the air were spider silk. He thought of Mathis in two parts, and Otto's hand steadying, and Ketson's hand on his collar, and Albrecht's bread. He thought of being called Tallow, and bending under a halberd, and being seen, and being unseen, and the way respect made men stand up, and the lack of it bent them to the weight of their own names. He closed his eyes. He counted 7 in, and held, and 7 out. He sat in the cold and the wet and let both have him until he shivered, because that was a thing he could own that was not owned by anyone else. He did not move the scrap. He did not burn it. He did not throw it away. "I'll be enough," he told the trees, and the stone, and the raven, and the part of himself that listened to drums. "I'll find a way." The raven blinked once and then took wing and went toward the river, because ravens are not sermons and do not care whether men keep their promises. The rain lifted to a mist that made everything more itself. Tallow gathered the litany and the scrap and tucked them away. He climbed out of the bowl. He wiped mud from his knees and did not see it come off. He walked back to the gate and went inside and lay down among the sleeping men and listened to their breathing until his fell into step with theirs. In the middle of the night, he woke to the sound of a drum very far away. It was not real, and it was. He put his hand on his wrist cord with its little notches and counted the prayers he had already said and the ones he would need, and the number did not make sense, but also it did. He smiled in the dark because smiling was a thing he could choose. He slept again with the rain tapping its slow code on the tent. When dawn came cold as a coin, the Red Pike Company formed ranks to march against whatever was left of the band that had burnt the hamlet. Tallow took his place, halberd correctly canted, shield tight on the arm, breath even. Ketson stopped in front of him and looked him up and down and grunted once. It could have been anything. It could have been something. Marta Kappel watched him from the gate as they went and chalked a small mark in her ledger she did not show anyone. Albrecht breathed in as if smelling bread baking and smiled at no one. The pines watched them go, old and uninterested. Behind the palisade, in a bowl of old stones, a man's heel had left a curved mark in the mud like the beginning of a circle. The story has come to an end. Our hearth still burns. Stay, warm yourself, and let sleep take you as the world drifts into silence.